Hello, hi again. We're back to the Princess and the Curdie, and I hiked up here again. It took an hour, and we're overlooking the ocean. It's a beautiful view. I don't know if my camera is capturing this view. It's just so amazing. Look, it's all ocean over there. All right, let's start, because some of you guys are just going right through it. If you want to know about George MacDonald, read the description that I have in this, and just in the video, or else if you're on the video somewhere else, look on YouTube, the description's there. I wish you much love. It's a beautiful day. It's very hot. I'm in Southern California. All right, let's go. All right, chapter 12, more creatures. I just showed the picture if you're listening to this. All right. One day from morning till night, they had been passing through a forest. As soon as the sun was down, Curdie began to be aware that there were more in it than themselves. More creatures in it than themselves. First he saw only the swift rush of a figure across the trees at some distance. Then he saw another, and then another at short intervals. Then he saw others, both farther off and nearer. At last, missing Lena and looking about after her, he saw an appearance as marvelous as herself steal up to her, and began conversing with her after some beast fashion which evidently she understood. Presently, what seemed a quarrel arose between them, and stranger noises followed, mingled with growling. At length it came to a fight, which had not lasted long, however, before the creature of the wood threw itself upon its back and held up its paws to Lena. Wow, doesn't that feel like life sometimes? All right, I won't. She instantly walked on. Here's the picture of her bringing that creature to. And there's another creature. There's some other creatures in the background. This is from an 1812 book, so I can use the pictures and everything. Free copyright domain. And the creatures got up and followed her. They had not gone far before another strange animal appeared, approaching Lena, when precisely the same thing was repeated, the vanquished animal rising and following with the former. Again and yet again and again a fresh animal came up, seemed to be reasoned, and certainly was fought with and overcome by Lena, until at last, before they were out of the wood, she was followed by 49 of the most grotesquely ugly and the most extravagantly abnormal animals imagination can conceive. To describe them were a hopeless task. I knew a boy who used to make animals out of heather roots. Like the roots around here. Wherever he could find 4 legs, he was pretty sure to find a head and a tail. His beasts were a most comic menagerie, and right fruitful of laughter. But they were not so grotesque and extravagant as Lena and her followers. One of them, for instance, was like a boa constrictor walking on 4 little stumpy legs near its tail. About the same distance from its head were 2 little wings, which it was forever fluttering as if trying to fly with them. Curdie thought it fancied it did fly with them, when it was merely plodding on busily with its 4 little stumps. How it managed to keep up he could not think, till once, when he missed it from the group, the same moment he caught sight of something at a distance, plunging at an awful serpentine rate through the trees, and presently, from behind a huge ash, this same creature fell again into the group, quietly waddling along on its four stumps. Watching it after this, he saw that when it was not able to keep up any longer, and they had all got a little space ahead, it shot into the wood away from the route and made a great round, serpenting along in huge billows of motion, devouring the ground, undulating awfully, galloping, as it were, all legs together, and its four stumps nowhere. In this mad fashion it shot ahead, and a few minutes after toddled in again amongst the rest, walking peacefully and somewhat painfully on its few fours. From the time it takes to describe one of them, it will be readily seen that it would hardly do to attempt a description of each of the 49. They were not a goodly company, but well worth contemplating nevertheless, and Curdie had been too long used to the goblins creatures in the mines and on the mountain to feel the least uncomfortable at being followed by such a herd. On the contrary, the marvelous vagaries of shape they manifested amused him greatly and shortened the journey much. Before they were all gathered, however, it had got so dark that he could see some of them only a part at a time, and every now and then, as the company wandered on, he would be startled by some extraordinary limb or feature undreamed of by him before, thrusting itself out of the darkness into the range of his ken. Excuse me. Probably there were some of his old acquaintances among them, although such had been the conditions of semi-darkness in which alone he had ever seen any of them, that it was not likely he would be able to identify any of them. On they marched solemnly, almost in silence, for either with feet or voice the creatures seldom made any noise. By the time they reached the outside of the wood, it was morning twilight. Into the open trooped the strange torrent of deformity, each one following Lena. Suddenly she stopped, turned towards them, and said something which they understood, although to Curdie's ear the sound she made seemed to have no articulation. Instantly they all turned and vanished into the forest, and Lena alone came trotting lithely and clumsily after her master. Here's a picture of that. Chapter 13. The Baker's Wife. They were now passing through a lovely country of hill and dale and rushing stream. The hills were abrupt, with broken chasms for watercourses, and deep little valleys full of trees. But now and then they came to a larger valley with a fine river, whose level banks and the adjacent meadows were dotted all over with red and white kine, while on the fields, that's cows, while on the fields above that sloped a little to the foot of the hills grew oats and barley and wheat. I think it is. And on the sides of the hills themselves, vines hung and chestnuts rose. They came at last to a broad, beautiful river, up which they must go to arrive at the city of Gwentistorm, where the king had his court. As they went, the valley narrowed and then the river, but still it was wide enough for large boats. After this, while the river kept its size, the banks narrowed until there was only room for a road between the river and the great cliffs that overhung it. At last, river and road took a sudden turn, and lo, a great rock in the river, which dividing, flowed around it, and on the top of the rock the city, with lofty walls and towers and battlements, and above the city the palace of the king, built like a strong castle. But the fortifications had long been neglected, for the whole country was now under one king, and all men said there was no more need for weapons or walls. No man pretended to love his neighbor, but everyone said he knew that peace and quiet behavior was the best thing for himself. Wow. I'm going to read that part again. No one pretended to love his neighbor, but everyone said he knew that peace and quiet behavior was the best thing for himself, and that, he said, was quite as useful and a great deal more reasonable, than loving your neighbor. The city was prosperous and rich, and if anybody was not comfortable, everybody else said he ought to be. When Curdie got up opposite the mighty rock, which sparkled all over with crystals, he found a narrow bridge defended by gates and portcullis and towers with loopholes, but the gates stood wide open and were dropping from their great hinges. And the portcullis was eaten away with rust and clung to the grooves, evidently immobile, while the loopholed towers had neither floor nor roof, and their tops were fast filling up their interiors. Curdie thought it a pity, if only for their old story, that they should be thus neglected. But everybody in the city regarded these signs of decay as the best proof of the prosperity of the place. Commerce and self-interest, they said, had got the better of violence, and the troubles of the past were whelmed in the riches that flowed in at their open gates. Indeed, there was at one set of philosophers in it which taught that it would be better to forget all the past history of the city, were it not that its former imperfections taught its present inhabitants how superior they and their times were, and enabled them to glory over their ancestors. Oh my goodness. If we don't understand that fairy stories teach us everything about right now. Anyway, I'm saying what the philosopher said again. Commerce and self-interest, they said, had got the better of violence, and the troubles of the past were whelmed in the riches that flowed in at their open gates. Indeed, there was one set of philosophers in it which taught that it would be better to forget all the past history of the city, were it not that its former imperfections taught its present inhabitants how superior they and their times were, and enabled them to glory over their ancestors. There were even certain quacks in the city who advertised pills for enabling people to think well of themselves. And some few bought of them, but most laughed and said with evident truth that they did not require them. Indeed, the general theme of discourse when they met was how much wiser they were than their fathers. Oh my goodness. Curdie crossed the river and began to ascend the winding road that led up to the city. They met a good many idlers, and all stared at them. Him and Lena, It was no wonder they should stare, but there was an unfriendliness in their looks which Curdie did not like. No one, however, offered them any molestation. Lena did not invite liberties. She's tough, After a long ascent, they reached the principal gates of the city and entered. The street was very steep, ascending towards the palace, which rose in great strength above all the houses. Just as they entered, a baker, whose shop was a few doors inside the gate, came out in his white apron and ran to the shop of his friend, the barber, on the opposite side of the way. But as he ran, he stumbled and fell heavily. Curdie hastened to help him up, and he found he had bruised his forehead badly. He swore grievously at the stone for tripping him up, declaring it was the third time he had fallen over it within the last month, and saying what was the king about that he allowed such a stone to stick up forever on the main street of his royal residence of Winterstorm. What was a king for if he would not take care of his people's heads? And he stroked his forehead tenderly. Was it your head or your feet that ought to bear the blame of your fall? Asked Curdie. There he is, helping him up. Why, you booby of a miner, my feet, of course, answered the baker. Nay, then, said the Curdie, the king can't be to blame. Oh, I see, said the baker. You're laying a trap for me. Of course, if you come to that, it was my head that ought to have looked after my feet, but it is the king's part to look after us all and have his streets smooth. I'll show the picture again. I hope you're well. Thanks for being here. I welcome you here. Share this video with your friends. and with everybody, because it's so good for our souls, Take some time to listen to The Princess and the Curdie by George MacDonald. All right, I was clearing a notification and it took me out of the video, so I'll combine these. All right. Okay, so he said, but it's the baker said, the king's part to look after us all and have his streets smooth. Well, I don't see, said Curdie, why the king should take care of the baker when the baker's head won't take care of the baker's feet. Who are you to make game of the king's baker? Cried the man in a rage. But instead of answering, Curdie went up to the bump on the street, which had repeated itself on the baker's head, and turning the hammer end of his mattock, struck it such a blow that it flew wide in pieces. Blow after blow he struck, until it had leveled it with the street. He had leveled it with the street. So he cleared it all up. But out flew the barber upon him in a rage. What did you break my window for, you rascal, with your pickaxe? Oh, I'm very sorry, said the Curdie. It must have been a bit of the stone that flew from my mattock. I couldn't help it, Couldn't help it? A fine story. What do you go breaking the rock for, the very rock upon which the city stands? Look at your friend's forehead, said Curdie. See what a lump he's got on it, with falling over the same stone. What's that to my window? Cried the barber. His forehead can mend itself. My poor window can't. But he's the king's baker, said Curdie, more and more surprised at the man's anger. What's that to me? This is a free city. Every man here takes care of himself, and the king takes care of us all. I have the price of my window out of you. I'll have the price of my window out of you, or the exchequer shall pay for it. Something caught Curdie's eye. He stooped, picked up a piece of the stone he had just broken, and put it in his pocket. I suppose you're going to break another of my windows with that stone, said the barber. Oh, no, said Curdie. I didn't mean to break your window, and I certainly won't break another. Give me that stone, said the barber. Curdie gave it him, and the barber threw it over the city wall. I thought you wanted the stone, said Curdie. No, you fool, answered the barber. What should I want with a stone? Curdie stooped and picked up another. Give me that stone, said the barber. No, answered Curdie. You've just told me you don't want a stone, and I do. The barber took Curdie by the collar. Come now, you pay me for that window. How much? Asked Curdie. The barber said, a crown. But the baker, annoyed at the heartlessness of the barber, and thinking more of his broken window than the bump on his friend's forehead, interfered. No, he said to Curdie, don't you pay any such sum. A little pain like that costs only a quarter. Well, to be certain, said Curdie, I'll give him a half. For he doubted the baker as well as the barber. Perhaps one day, if he find he has asked too much, he will bring me the difference. Ha, ha, laughed the barber. A fool and his money are soon parted. But as he took the coin from Curdie's hand, he grasped it in an affected reconciliation and real satisfaction. In Curdie's, his was the cold, smooth, leathery palm of a monkey. Oh, he touched his hand, and now remember he has the skill to see what kind of animal the person is becoming. He looked up, almost expecting to see him pop the money in his cheek, like a little playing monkey does. But he had not yet got so far as that, though he was well on the road to it. Then he would have no other pocket. I'm glad that stone is gone anyhow, said the baker. It was the bane of my life. I had no idea how easy it was to remove it. Give me your pickaxe, young miner, and I will show you how a baker can make the stones fly. He caught the tool out of Curdie's hand and flew at one of the foundation stones of the gateway, but he jarred his arm terribly, scarcely chipping the stone, dropping the mattock with a cry of pain, and ran into his own shop. Curdie picked up his implement, and looking after the baker, saw bread in the window and followed him in, but the baker, ashamed of himself and thinking he was coming to laugh at him, popped out of the back door. And when Curdie entered, the baker's wife came from the bakehouse to serve him. Curdie requested to know the price of a certain good-sized loaf. Now the baker's wife had been watching what had passed since first her husband ran out of the shop, and she liked the look of Curdie. She was more honest than her husband. Casting a glance at the back door, she replied, "It's not the best spread. I will sell you a loaf of what we bake for ourselves." And when she had spoken, she laid a finger on her lips. "Take care of yourself in this place, my son," she added. "They do not love strangers. I was once a stranger here, and I know what I say." Then, fancying she heard her husband, "That is a strange animal you have," she said in a louder voice. "Yes," answered Curdie, "she is no beauty, but she is very good, and we love each other, don't we, Lena?" Lena looked up and whined. Curdie threw her the half of his loaf, which she ate, while her master and the baker's wife talked a little. Then the baker's wife gave them some water, and Curdie, having paid for his loaf, he and Lena went up the street together. Here's what's going to happen next. The Dogs of Gwentystorm, Storm, Chapter 14. Under this it says the dogs attack Lena. The steep street led them straight up to a large marketplace with butchers' shops, about which there were many dogs. The moment they caught sight of Lena, one and all, they came rushing down upon her, giving her no chance of explaining herself. When Curdie saw the dogs coming, he heaved up his mattock over his shoulder, and was ready if they would have it so. Seeing him thus prepared to defend his follower, a great ugly bulldog flew at him. With the first blow, Curdie struck him through the brain. And the brute fell dead at his feet. But he could not at once recover his weapon, which stuck in the skull of his foe, and a huge mastiff, seeing him thus hampered, flew at him next. Now Lena, who had shown herself so brave upon the road thither, had grown shy upon entering the city, and kept always at Curdie's heel. But it was her turn now. The moment she saw her master in danger, she seemed to go mad with rage. As the mastiff jumped at Curdie's throat, Lena flew at his, seized him with her tremendous jaws, gave one roaring grind, and he lay beside the bulldog with his neck broken. They were the best dogs in the market after the judgment of the butchers of Gwentystorm. Down came their masters, knife in hand. Curdie drew himself up fearlessly, mattock on his shoulder, and awaited their coming, while at his heel his awful attendant showed not only her outside fringe of icicle teeth, but a double row of right serviceable fangs she wore inside her mouth, and her green eyes flashed yellow as gold. The butchers, not liking the look either of them or of the dogs at their feet, drew back and began to remonstrate in the manner of outraged men. Where they're going around like throwing their arms up and that, "Stranger," said the first, "that bulldog is mine." "Take him then," said Curdie, indignant. "You've killed him." "Yes, else he would have killed me." He had to, It was a wild. I got bit by a dog the other day when I was visiting my brother in Arkansas. It was crazy. It was like it bit through this really thick coat thing that I had on. I wish Curdie had been by me. I wouldn't want the animal dead, but I could have been dead. It bit right under my arm. Okay, so, yes, else he would have killed me. "That's no business of mine." No. This is Curdie talking to this guy with the knife. "That makes it the more mine then." It's the butcher. It's the butcher. This sort of thing won't do, said the other butcher. Oh, is that other butcher? Okay. So they're all the butchers. "That's true," said Curdie. "That's my mastiff," said the butcher. "As he ought to be," said Curdie, as he ought to be. He ought to be yours, where you teach him not to attack strangers like that, I have a friend that has very, very deadly dogs, but they're very well trained. But I was scared to be in her apartment with just the dogs. But she told me afterwards, I would have never left anyone with them that, they didn't know like that. Anyway, we have these elements within ourselves, and we're meant to be masters, but I won't go into all of the inner meaning. But enter into it yourself. I welcome you. That's my mastiff, said the butcher. As he ought to be, said Curdie. Your brute shall be burnt alive for it, said the butcher. Not yet, answered the Curdie. We have done no wrong. We were walking quietly up your street when your dogs flew at us. If you don't teach your dogs how to treat strangers, you must take the consequences. They treat them quite properly, said the butcher. What right has anyone to bring an abomination like that into our city? The horror is enough to make an idiot of every child in the place. We are both subjects of the king, and my poor animal can't help her looks. How would you like to be served like that, because you were ugly? She's not a bit fonder of her looks than you are, only what can she do to change them? I'll do to change them, said the fellow. Thereupon the butchers brandished their long knives and advanced, keeping their eyes upon Lena. Don't be afraid, Lena, cried Curdie. I'll kill one, you kill the other. Lena gave a howl that might have terrified an army, and crouched ready to spring. The butchers turned and ran. Oh, look, these two hawks. They're right close. Can you see them? Oh no. There we go. By this time, a great crowd had gathered behind the butchers, and in it a number of boys returning from school who began to stone the strangers. It was a way they had with man or beast they did not expect to make anything by. They couldn't use them, to their own purposes. So they start to stone them. This happens in life, when people reject you for no reason and don't know your value. But we ought to know our own value, Sorry, I'm speaking as a psychologist, and from my own experience. What I was contemplating on the way up here, I didn't know this was going to be part of the chapter today. So, it was a way they had with men or beasts they did not expect to make anything by. One of the stones struck Lena. She caught it in her teeth and crunched it, that it fell in gravel from her mouth. Some of the foremost of the crowd saw this, and it terrified them. They drew back. The rest took fright from the retreat. The panic spread, and at last the crowd scattered in all directions. They ran and cried out, and said the devil and his dam were come to Gwentystorm. So Curdie and Lena were left standing unmolested in the marketplace. But the terror of them spread throughout the city, and everybody began to shout and lock his doors, so that by the time the setting sun shone down the street, there was not a shop left open, for fear of the devil and his horrible dam. D-A-M, damsel. Like madame. But all the upper windows within sight of them were crowded with heads watching them where they stood lonely in the deserted marketplace. Curdie looked carefully all round, but could not see one open door. He caught sight of the sign of an inn, however, and laying down his mattock and telling Lena to take care of it, walked up to the door of it and knocked. But the people in the house, instead of opening the door, threw things at him from the windows. They would not listen to a word he said, but sent him back to Lena, with the blood running down his face. When Lena saw that, she leaped up in a fury and was rushing at the house, into which she would certainly have broken, but Curdie called her and made her lie down beside him, while he bethought him what next he should do. "Lena," he said, "the people keep their gates open, but their houses and their hearts shut." As if she knew it was her presence that had brought this trouble upon him, she rose and went round and around, purring like a tigress and rubbing herself against his legs. Now there was one little thatched house that stood squeezed in between two tall gables, and the sides of the two great houses shot out projecting windows that nearly met across the roof of the little one, so that it lay in the street like a doll's house. In this house lived a poor old woman with a grandchild, and because she never gossiped or quarrelled, or chaffered in the market, but went without what she could not afford, the people called her a witch, and would have done her many an ill turn if they had not been afraid of her. Now while Curdie was looking in another direction, the door opened, and out came a little dark-haired, black-eyed, gypsy-looking child, and toddled across the marketplace towards the outcasts. The moment they saw her coming, Lena lay down flat on the road, and with her two huge forepaws covered her mouth, while Curdie went to meet her, holding out his arms. The little one came straight to him and held up her mouth to be kissed. Then she took him by the hand and drew him towards the house, and Curdie yielded to the silent invitation, but when Lena rose to follow, the child shrunk from her, frightened a little. Curdie took her up, and holding her on one arm, patted Lena with her other hand. Then the child wanted also to pat Doggie, as she called her, by a right bountiful stretch of courtesy, and having once patted her, nothing would serve but Curdie must let her have a ride on Doggie. So he set her on Lena's back, holding her hand as she rode home in merry triumph, all unconscious of the hundreds of eyes staring at her foolhardiness from the windows about the marketplace, or the murmur of deep disapproval that rose from as many lips. At the door stood the grandmother to receive them. She caught the child to her bosom with delight at her courage, welcomed Curdie, and showed no dread of Lena. Many were the significant nods exchanged, and many a one said to another that the devil and the witch were old friends. But the woman was only a wise woman, who, having seen how Curdie and Lena behaved to each other, judged from that what sort they were, and so made them welcome to her house. She was not like her fellow townspeople, for that they were strangers. Recommended them to her. Because they were strangers, that recommended them to her. The moment her door was shut, the other doors began to open, and soon there appeared little groups about here and there a threshold, while a few of the more courageous ventured out upon the square, all ready to make for their houses again, however, upon the least sign of movement in the little thatched one. The baker and the barber had joined one of these groups, and they were busily wagging their tongues against Curdie and his horrible beast. "He can't be honest," said the barber, "for he paid me double the worth of the pane he broke at my window." And then he told them how Curdie broke his window by breaking a stone in the street with his hammer. There the baker struck in. "Now that was the stone," said he, "over which I had fallen 3 times within the last month. Could it be by fair means he broke that to pieces at the first blow? Just to make up my mind on that point, I tried his own hammer against a stone in the gate, and it nearly broke both my arms and loosened half the teeth in my head." Aw, there's the little girl. That was that. I didn't even look at the picture. I just showed you guys. I'm going to see how long this is, because I don't know how long the other part of this video was that got cut off, but I try to keep these at 30 to 45 minutes. Okay, it looks like I can read this. I keep wanting to run up here or run to the beach so I can read this, because I don't want to go ahead of you guys, and I just love this story and I want to read it. So it's like God found a way to motivate me to keep making these for us, you know. Durba and Barbara. Meantime, the wanderers this is chapter 15, were hospitably entertained by the old woman and her grandchild, and they were all very comfortable and happy together. Little Barbara sat upon Curdie's knee, and he told her stories about the mines and his adventures in them, but he never mentioned the king or the princess, for all that story was hard to believe. And he told her about his mother and his father and how good they were. And Durba, her name is Durba, sat and listened. At last little Barbara fell asleep in Curdie's arms, and her grandmother carried her to bed. It was a poor little house, and Durba gave up her own room to Curdie because he was honest and talked wisely. Curdie saw how it was and begged her to allow him to lie on the floor, but she would not hear of it. In the night, he was waked by Lena pulling at him. As soon as he spoke to her, she ceased, and Curdie, listening, thought he heard someone trying to get in. He rose, took his mattock, and went about the house, listening and watching. But although he heard noises now at one place, now at another, he could not think what they meant, for no one appeared. Certainly, considering how she had frightened them all in the day, it was not likely anyone would attack Lena at night. By and by the noises ceased, and Curdie went back to his bed and slept undisturbed. In the morning, however, Durba came to him in great agitation and said they had fastened up the door so that she could not get out. Curdie rose immediately and went with her. They found that not only the door but every window in the house was so secured on the outside that it was impossible to open one of them without using great force. Poor Durba looked anxiously in Curdie's face. He broke out laughing. "They are much mistaken," he said, "if they fancy they could keep Lena and a miner in any house in Gwentystorm, even if they built up doors and windows." With that he shouldered his mattock, but Durba begged him not to make a hole in her house just yet. She had plenty for breakfast, she said, and before it was time for dinner, they would know what the people meant by it, and indeed they did. For within an hour appeared one of the chief magistrates of the city, accompanied by a score of soldiers with drawn swords, and followed by a great multitude of the people, requiring the miner and his brute to yield themselves, the one that he might be tried for the disturbance he had occasioned and the injury he had committed, and the other that she might be roasted alive for her part in killing two valuable and harmless animals belonging to worthy citizens. The summons was preceded and followed by flourish of trumpet, and was read with every formality by the city marshal himself. The moment he ended, Lena ran into the little passage and stood opposite the door. "I surrender," cried Curdie. "Then tie up your brute and give her here." "No, no," cried Curdie through the door. "I surrender, but I'm not going to do your hangman's work. If you want my dog, you must take her." "Then we shall set the house on fire and burn witch and all." "It will go hard with us, but we shall kill a few dozen of you first," cried Curdie. "We're not the least afraid of you." With that, Curdie turned to Durba and said, "Don't be frightened. I have a strong feeling that all will be well. Surely no trouble will come to you for being good to strangers." "But the poor dog," said Durba. Now Curdie and Lena understood each other more than a little by this time, and not only had he seen that she understood the proclamation, but when she looked up at him after it was read, it was with such a grin and such a yellow flash that he saw also that she was determined to take care of herself. "The dog will probably give you reason to think a little more of her ere long," he answered. But now he went on, "I fear I must hurt your house a little. I have great confidence, however, that I shall be able to make up to you for it one day." "Never mind the house, if only you can get safe off," she answered. "I don't think they will hurt this precious lamb," she added, clasping little Barbara to her bosom. "For myself, it is all one. I am ready for anything." "It is but a little hole for Lena I want to make," said Curdie. "She can creep through a much smaller one than you would think." Again he took his mattock and went to the back wall. "They won't burn the house," he said to himself. There's too good a one on each side of it." The other houses, you know. The tumult had kept increasing every moment, and the city marshal had been shouting, but Curdie had not listened to him. When now they heard the blows of his mattock, there went up a great cry, and the people taunted the soldiers that they were afraid of a dog and his miner. The soldiers, therefore, made a rush at the door and cut its fastenings. The moment they opened it, out leaped Lena with a roar so unnaturally horrible that the sword arms of the soldiers dropped by their sides, paralyzed with the terror of that cry. The crowd fled in every direction, shrieking and yelling with mortal dismay, and without even knocking down with her tail, not to say biting a man of them with her pulverizing jaws, Lena vanished, no one knew whither, for not one of the crowd had had the courage to look upon her. The moment she was gone, Curdie advanced and gave himself up. The soldiers were so filled with fear, shame, and chagrin that they were ready to kill him on the spot. But he stood quietly facing them with his mattock on his shoulder, and the magistrate, wishing to examine him, and the people to see him made an example of, the soldiers had to content themselves with taking him, partly for derision, partly to hurt him. They laid his mattock against his back and tied his arms to it. They led him up a very steep street, and up another still, all the crowd following. The king's palace castle rose towering above them, but they stopped before they reached it, and at a low-browed door in a great, dull, heavy-looking building. The city marshal opened it with a key which hung at his girdle and ordered Curdie to enter. The place within was dark as night, and while he was feeling his way with his feet, the marshal gave him a rough push, and he fell and rolled once or twice over, unable to help himself because his hands were tied behind him. Oh, here. Here's the picture. It was the hour of the magistrate's second and more important breakfast. Second breakfast, like the hobbits, And until that was over, he never found himself capable of attending a case with concentration sufficient to the distinguishing of the side upon which his own advantage lay, and hence was the respite for Curdie, with time to collect his thoughts. But indeed he had very few to collect, for all he had to do, so far as he could see, was to wait for what would come next. Neither had he much power to collect them, for he was a good deal shaken. In a few minutes he discovered, to his great relief, that from the projection of the pick end of his mattock behind his body, the fall had loosened the ropes tied round it. He got one hand disengaged, and then the other, and presently stood free, with his good mattock once more in his right serviceable relation to his arms and legs. All right, chapter 16 is what we'll get back to next time. Much love. Thanks for being here. I didn't do a lot of commenting. I just wanted to read today. Share and like and comment. It helps with the algorithms. And watch this all the way through if you can. And all of them all the way through. I'm growing my channel organically. I don't want to do any ads or buy any followers. So please share this with other people. Much love, always.